It's time for The Verdict. The Verdict is a lively discussion of current events and legal issues pertinent to Oklahomans. The Verdict is hosted by Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. It's time for The Verdict.
And welcome once again to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett, and I'm joined, as always, by one of Oklahoma's top legal experts, Kent Myers. Kent, what do we have today?
Hospitals. Try not to go unless you have to, but let's always hope there's one available if you do. Hospitals are undergoing enormous change in Oklahoma, not simply in Oklahoma, but nationwide. And there's some changes that our Oklahoma viewers are going to observe, I think, if they haven't already, particularly in regard to trauma units and the emergency rooms. We're seeing more and more Oklahomans having to visit or choosing to visit the emergency rooms, and that's putting a strain that had not been present before. Moreover, many of us have to deal with what I'll simply call end-of-life issues with a loved one in the hospital setting, and sometimes those things aren't planned out in advance as well as they could be, causing some problems not only for the hospitals and the physicians, but for the family. And we're going to be talking with two people who know an awful lot about problems in Oklahoma hospitals today, and I think we'll learn some things.
Hospitals and the issues that affect hospitals in Oklahoma. It's next on The Verdict. And welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers is going to introduce our guests.
We are very pleased today to have two people who know an awful lot about how hospitals run and are operated in Oklahoma and how they solve the problems they must face daily. Across the table is a partner of mine, Karen Rieger, works with Crow and Dunleavy in the healthcare area. She is in charge of our healthcare law section. Karen did her undergraduate work at the University of Oklahoma as well as her law work. She graduated with honors in 1981 from the University of Oklahoma College of Law. She speaks and writes often in the healthcare area dealing with legal subjects. She has a distinction of being listed in a fine publication called Best Lawyers in America in the healthcare law section. And this is her first appearance on The Verdict, but I hope not her last. Karen, thanks for joining us.
Sure, pleased to be here, Kent.
We're glad to have you. Next to me is Craig Jones. Craig is the president of the Oklahoma Hospital Association and has been for the past 5 years. His undergraduate work, I didn't talk to you about this before we started the show, but he got his undergraduate degree from Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, the home place of my mother.
Oh my gosh.
And she came to Oklahoma many years ago from Grove City, Pennsylvania. So that's a nice remembrance for me. Craig also got his master's degree in health administration from Washington University School of Medicine in 1976, again with honors. He's affiliated, has been affiliated with several hospitals in an executive capacity before joining the Oklahoma Hospital Association. And this, likewise, is his first appearance on The Verdict. And, Craig, we're really pleased to have you.
Appreciate it, Kent, very much.
Glad you're here. Well, let's stay with Craig just a minute and tell us about the Oklahoma Hospital Association. How many hospitals approximately join? Do they have to join? What's your mission? Just tell our viewers about what your association is and does.
The Oklahoma Hospital Association, Kent, is a trade organization of approximately 129 hospitals across the state. We represent probably 95+% of all the general acute and some specialty healthcare facilities. Our objective is to partner with those hospitals and healthcare systems to provide a unified voice for promoting the welfare of Oklahomans across the state in terms of how those facilities promote that welfare through their services. We do a lot of activity at the state capitol on issues in representing healthcare, both locally at the local level as well as across the state. We do a lot of federal advocacy. We put on a number of educational programs trying to help our hospitals stay apprised of healthcare issues, help them and assist them in their operational needs. And then we also have a series of products, some of them in the insurance arena, some of them in the strategic information arena, that aids in the hospital's operations as well.
Okay. Well, we're pleased you're here.
Thank you.
Craig, I know the business in the emergency rooms is on the increase. Why is that, and how's that affecting hospitals?
Well, it is, Mick, and in fact there was a recent study that I was just reading the other day that cited that from a period of time of 1996 to 2001, the level of increase in emergency visits across the country was 16%. Interestingly, the vast majority of that increase was from people who have insurance. I think most of the time when we think of visits to the emergency department increasing, we think of those that don't have insurance, that they use that instead of going to the physician. And clearly that has happened, and that's on the rise. That same study indicated that I think there was a 37% decrease in the number of visits to the physician by those that don't have insurance. I think the economy has driven that. We have employers that have had to make changes in their insurance coverage, dropping it perhaps, or increasing deductibles and co-pays. And I think at the same time, it's more convenient for people to go to the emergency department. We have a lot of two-income families, both the wife and the husband work, and getting to the physician during work time is difficult. So I think that's probably some of the reasons.
Not quite as busy as the activity one might see if they were watching ER, I suppose.
Well, it all depends upon the need in the hospital, that's for sure.
Karen, let me ask you, you told me before we started today about a new act, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, a long title, but generally, what does that involve, and how does it affect the emergency rooms in hospitals?
Well, Kent, it's a federal statute, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, and the purpose of the act is to be sure that any patient who has a true emergency medical condition can go to a hospital emergency room, be screened for that condition, and receive stabilizing treatment. The government, before this statute was passed, they were seeing a trend in some people, particularly people that didn't have insurance, perhaps not getting the type of stabilizing care they needed in a true emergency situation.
You mean being turned away?
Being turned away because of inability to pay or whatever. So the federal government mandated that any hospital that participates in Medicare and Medicaid, sees Medicare patients, provide this stabilizing treatment to anyone, not just Medicare beneficiaries, but any patient that thinks they have an emergency medical condition can go to a hospital and be screened, and if they do have an emergency medical condition, is entitled to have that condition stabilized.
So they can't be turned away if they don't have insurance?
That's right.
Well, let me ask you both a question. Approximately of the many hospitals we have in Oklahoma, how many of them do treat Medicare and Medicaid patients? Virtually all, or none, or how does?
I would say virtually all do, unless they're very specialized, but I would say virtually all, yes.
Right.
Well, so this would apply to all the hospitals, for instance, in the metropolitan area of any size.
That's right. Yeah, virtually every hospital has this responsibility. The problem is the intent behind the statute obviously is important and is important for the welfare of the country. The problem is there's no funding that's associated with the statute, and so if a patient comes in, doesn't have the ability to pay, hospitals are required to provide that treatment. They've got costs associated with providing that care, and so if they can't recover from that particular patient, they've got to do something to shift the cost, perhaps, to other patients. And that's where, we've heard a lot recently about healthcare costs going up, particularly if you're uninsured and you haven't negotiated a good rate with your hospital, the cost going up for people who can't afford to pay, to try to cover the cost for those who can't.
Let me get us to a break. Karen Rieger, Craig Jones, we're discussing hospitals in Oklahoma and the issues that involve hospitals. You're watching The Verdict. We'll be right back. Mick Cornetta and Kent Myers back on The Verdict. This week's guests are Karen Rieger and Craig Jones. We're discussing the concerns and challenges of hospitals in Oklahoma. And Craig, I know right when we went to a break, we were discussing whether or not hospitals can get penalized in certain situations. Why don't you pick up there and tell us?
Well, there are very strict rules governing the manner in which hospitals can transfer patients. And the point I was raising is that if, in fact, hospitals violate those rules and regulations, there can be severe penalties. I think the least amount is $25,000 per occurrence. We've had some of those fines in Oklahoma. And it really has to do with trying to protect whether or not a hospital, as we say, gets dumped on by virtue of the fact that the transferring hospital didn't stabilize the patient properly, or perhaps transfer the patient for economic reasons, not medical reasons.
Karen, let me ask you a kind of a related question. Let's say we have an auto accident in Oklahoma City and the patient is unconscious. IMSA is called and picks up the patient. How does IMSA know where to take the patient?
Well, IMSA has a set of criteria in place looking at the condition of the patient, the treatment that that patient is going to need, and they match that with the closest hospital that has the capability to treat that patient.
Not all hospitals are equal in that regard.
Right. Some hospitals can handle, neurosurgery better than others, or some may not have a neurosurgeon on staff, that type of thing. So they would go to the one that's the most appropriate for that patient.
Okay.
A lot of this seems to come back to financials. I know in Oklahoma we have a lot of uninsured citizens. Why do we have so many, and is there anything we can do about it?
Well, that's a really complicated issue, and I think Craig may know more about that than I. I think costs have been going up again. For a while, costs were kind of stabilizing when we had managed care, but I think we've seen an increase over the last few years. As those costs go up, many employers have borne that cost, or a lot of that cost, for their employees, and it just becomes so expensive that they are shifting some more cost to the employees, or even dropping coverage altogether if they can't afford it. And that leads to higher uninsurance numbers, I think, in the state.
The average viewer, Mick, may not realize the fact that 19% of the entire population in Oklahoma is uninsured, have no insurance at all. And that is well above the national average. As Karen indicated, that is probably the most troubling trend in our state, as well as the fact that even those that are covered by, say, a state and federal program like Medicaid, which is approximately 10% of the population, hospitals are only getting paid about, on the average, 62 cents for every dollar of cost that they incur to treat those patients.
Is there a geographic trend to that 19%? Are people that live in a city more or less likely to have insurance than a person who lives in a rural area?
Well, I think you see a larger percentage of rural population just by virtue of the demographics that fall into that particular category. But probably the situation gets exacerbated in the metropolitan areas, because that's where you would have a higher degree of cost associated with the increased level of intensity of services.
Let me kind of change the subject just a minute. I want to make sure we cover this before we run out of time, and that's end-of-life issues. I want to go ahead and jump right to that. The Terry Schiavo case in Florida has gotten a lot of recent publicity with the husband, with a patient who's been in bad shape for a number of years, over 10 years, and the husband trying to have the life support systems turned off or nourishment stopped, and the parents of the patient objecting. Karen, where are we on that kind of an issue on the Schiavo case, or in how would that be resolved in Oklahoma?
Well, I think we'd have the same issue, Kent, that we're seeing in Florida and in probably most other states as well. In Oklahoma, and I think many people are surprised by this fact, but a spouse or a parent, a family member, does not have an automatic right to make treatment decisions for an adult patient. That patient really is the only one authorized to make those treatment decisions. They can authorize another person through a living will or a healthcare proxy to make those decisions, or there can be a court-appointed guardian for that patient if the patient's incompetent, appointed to make treatment decisions. But there's no automatic right of the family members to make those decisions. And that's where I think we run into difficulty a lot of times. And Craig, I'm sure hospitals face that every day.
We really do, and that's a perfect case down there in Florida, where when you don't have an advance directive or a living will, and you have family members, the end of life or the conditions, whether it be terminal illness, whether it be unconscious patients, or whatever, it's a very stressful and emotional time. And oftentimes, family members are not in concert with what should be going on with that patient. There's a difference. There's guilt involved. It brings out so many things. And in the absence of some type of a legal document that documents the wishes of the patient, you have that type of situation that the people in Florida are facing.
But in that situation in the hospital where you don't have an appropriate legal directive and nobody to say what decision, what treatment to be given, who does make the decision? The doctors? The hospital?
Well,
Somebody has to.
I think a lot of times, if all the family members in agreement, all the family members are in agreement as to the course of action, then I think, you know, many hospitals are willing to go forward with those wishes, knowing that there's not really a true legal authorization to rely on the family members. But if there's no disagreement, then the risk is minimal, and that seems to be what the patient, what the family wants. The problem is if you have a situation like the Florida case where the family members are in disagreement over what should be done. Oklahoma law presumes that a patient wants everything done to preserve their life unless the patient indicates otherwise.
Karen, Craig mentioned a living will. Can you define for our audience that isn't aware, what is a living will and should everybody have one?
Yes, a living will is a document that's recognized in Oklahoma law that allows a person to indicate what type of care they want and don't want really at the end of life. If they have a terminal condition, which is defined in Oklahoma as someone being expected to die within 6 months, if you have cancer or some other terminal disease, or if you're persistently unconscious, if you're in a coma or in a state where you just are unaware of your surroundings. In those situations, you can direct what kind of care you want and what kind you don't want. For example, whether you want to be placed on a respirator, whether you want to be resuscitated under those circumstances.
Do those have to be done by a lawyer, or can they be done by the adult prospective patient?
They really don't have to be done by a lawyer. There are sample forms. The statute actually spells out what needs to be included in that form. The Department of Human Services has sample forms that anyone can obtain. And they're really fairly simple to fill out. The patient does need to give it some thought and needs to think about the different circumstances they might be in and what they would want under those circumstances.
About 30 seconds left, Ken.
Craig, looking down the road 5 years, 10 years from now, we're going to have more hospitals, fewer hospitals, bigger hospitals, more split-off trauma centers. What do you see in the hospital future?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that the overall number of hospitals, for the most part, will be the same, although certainly the ability to sustain a general hospital in some of the rural areas is becoming increasingly difficult, largely because of the uninsured question that we have talked about and that increase. The workforce shortage is a growing problem. That is something that's national. There's a lot of effort to be doing that. At the same time, I think we'll see a lot of technological changes, and some of the things that have moved outside the hospital I think will continue to. But I think the lack of having sufficient funds going into the program will probably be the most concern for hospitals across the state.
We're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you both for coming, Karen Rieger, Craig Jones. We appreciate it. Kent and I'll be back with a few final thoughts after this. You're watching The Verdict with Mick Cornett and Kent Myers. Mick Cornett and Kent Myers, we are back to wrap up another edition of The Verdict. And today we discussed hospitals and the issues that are involved with hospitals in Oklahoma.
So many of our viewers and our citizens have occasionally the opportunity or a problem of having to visit a hospital, perhaps on an emergency basis. And we thought you'd be interested in understanding what changes are forthcoming. Just a couple of weeks ago, the University of Oklahoma Medical Center announced that it was shutting down its trauma center, apparently for a number of reasons, not the least of which would be economic. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens in a hospital setting as the visitations to the emergency room increase. And yet, and federal legislation passed requiring hospitals to treat people in emergency situations, whether or not they're insured, and yet no funding available to recover the cost of the hospitals in doing that. This is putting a real strain on hospitals, and I think they're being rather ingenious to come up with additional funding methods to keep open and keep providing the fine care that our hospitals in Oklahoma provide.
I want to provide our viewers with the website for the Oklahoma Hospital Association. It is www.okoha.com. And of course, as always, be sure and check out our website, theverdict.tv. And thanks again to our guests, Karen Rieger and Craig Jones. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We'll see you next time on The Verdict.